The morning started like any other, quiet and calm. The kind of day that usually made him feel grateful for the small routines of life. He stepped outside with his cup of tea, letting the warm steam brush against his face as he looked over the street. The neighborhood always felt peaceful at that hour. Only a few cars passed, birds hopped along fences, and the air still held that early chill. But that morning, something felt off. He noticed a paper taped to his front door. At first, he thought it might be a delivery notice, or maybe a flyer someone had left by mistake. But when he stepped closer, he felt a small knot of worry in his stomach. It wasn't just any paper. It had the HOA's letterhead printed at the top. He slowly peeled it off the door and read it right there on the porch. The notice said he had violated a rule about the appearance of his front yard. According to the letter, something about the way he arranged a few potted plants didn't follow community guidelines. He blinked at the words, confused. The plants had been sitting in the same spot for months. If something was wrong with them, why hadn't anyone said anything before? For a moment, he tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was a simple misunderstanding, a quick mistake the HOA would clear up once he asked. But even as he tried to brush it aside, the wording in the letter felt too sharp. It wasn't a gentle reminder. It sounded like a warning. He folded the paper and stepped back inside, still feeling uneasy. The rest of his morning felt heavier than usual. He kept thinking about the notice, wondering why it bothered him so much. Maybe it was because he had always tried to be a respectful neighbor. He followed the rules, kept his yard clean, and never caused trouble. He wasn't the kind of person who wanted conflict. Later that day, he talked to a couple of neighbors he was friendly with. He casually mentioned the notice, hoping maybe they had gotten one too and this was just some random HOA sweep. But they shook their heads. They hadn't received anything. They looked surprised and even a bit uncomfortable when he showed them the letter. One neighbor, an older man who had lived there longer than most, gave him a slow, knowing look. "You're not the first one they've sent something like this to," the man said quietly. "Sometimes they get a little strict." The way he said it made the homeowner pause. Strict was one word for it, but the tone suggested something else. Something unspoken. Something he wasn't sure he wanted to think about yet. Still, he tried to stay calm. There had to be a reasonable explanation. So he decided he would go to the next HOA meeting, which was scheduled a couple of days later. He thought it would be simple. Just ask a question, get an answer, clear everything up. That was the polite way to handle things. When the evening of the meeting arrived, he walked toward the community center with the folded notice in his pocket. The building was small, but always spotless inside, with tables neatly arranged and chairs lined up in rows. A few board members sat at the front, looking very serious as they shuffled papers and typed on laptops. He took a seat quietly and waited. When it was time for residents to speak, he raised his hand and politely explained the situation. He showed them the letter and asked why he had received it. He expected a friendly explanation, or maybe a quick apology instead. The board members glanced at each other with blank expressions. One of them spoke in a tone that felt dismissive, almost irritated, as if he was wasting their time. They told him that the rules were clear, and if he had received a notice, then it must mean something was wrong. They didn't want to look at photos, and they didn't seem interested in hearing his side. He tried to stay patient. He explained again that nothing in his yard had changed recently. He wasn't arguing, he just wanted clarity. But they brushed him off with cold responses. "If you want to avoid further issues," one board member said, "you should follow the instructions in the notice." He sat back, surprised by how quickly the conversation had shut down. It felt like they weren't even listening. It wasn't just strictness. There was something almost personal in the way they spoke. Something that didn't sit right. After the meeting ended, he walked home slowly. The night air felt cooler, and the peaceful neighborhood seemed different somehow, like a quiet tension had settled over it. He kept replaying the board members' expressions in his mind, how they hardly looked at him, how they acted as if he was already in the wrong. Back at home, he put the notice on the kitchen table and stared at it again. The bold, printed words felt heavier this time, almost like a warning of something worse. He tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to him. He remembered the older neighbor's words from earlier, the way he said the HOA could get a little strict. Maybe strict wasn't strong enough. Maybe the HOA acted differently depending on who they were dealing with. Maybe they pushed people around hoping no one would question them. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. But something about the whole situation felt unfair. He knew he wasn't the type to cause trouble. But he also wasn't someone who backed down when he knew he had done nothing wrong. So he decided he would start writing everything down, dates, photos of his yard. He wasn't planning on fighting anyone, not yet. But he needed to protect himself in case things got worse. That night, he went to bed with a strange sense of unease. Unsure why such a small notice could disturb him so deeply, but deep down, he already sensed the truth. This was only the beginning. The HOA wasn't finished with him yet, and the next steps they took would make things much more complicated than he ever expected. The next few days passed slowly, though he tried not to think too much about the first notice. He kept reminding himself that it was probably nothing serious. Maybe just an overworked board member doing their job a little too strictly. But even with that thought, a small sense of worry lingered in his mind. He found himself checking the front yard more often than usual, making sure everything looked neat and clean. He didn't want to give the HOA any reason to bother him again. But only 4 days after the first letter, another envelope arrived. This time it wasn't taped to his door. It was placed directly in his mailbox, folded too neatly, like someone had taken their time preparing it. When he opened it, he felt his chest tighten. The letter stated he had failed to correct the violation mentioned earlier, and now he would need to pay a fine. The amount wasn't huge, but it wasn't small either. Enough to make anyone stop and question it. More than that, the tone of the letter was cold and firm, almost accusing him of ignoring their instructions on purpose. He sat down on his living room couch and read the letter twice. He couldn't believe they had moved so quickly. He hadn't even done anything wrong. His front yard looked exactly the same as it had for years, simple, clean, and well kept. There wasn't a single thing out of place. All he could think about was the meeting he had attended, the way the board members had acted, the way they refused to listen. He began to realize this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. Something was off. Something felt targeted. Later that afternoon, he walked over to a neighbor who lived a few houses down, someone who had always been friendly and open. He wanted to ask if they had ever received similar notices. When he gently brought it up, the neighbor shifted uncomfortably and gave a small sigh. "Honestly," the neighbor said, lowering their voice, "the board has been acting strange lately. They've been sending out letters to people for the smallest things. Sometimes things that aren't even real problems. I don't know what they're trying to do, but you're not the only one who's been frustrated." Hearing that made him feel slightly relieved, but also more worried. If this was happening to others, then maybe the board was trying to control the neighborhood in ways that weren't fair. He wondered how many residents had just paid the fines quietly, hoping to avoid drama. He thanked the neighbor and went back home, thinking hard about what to do next. He could pay the fine and be done with it, but something inside him hated the idea of giving in to something that felt wrong. He had worked too hard for his home to let someone push him around without reason. That evening, he sat at his dining table with a notebook in front of him. He wrote down everything that had happened so far, the dates, the exact wording of both notices, and even the small details he remembered from the meeting. He took photos of his yard from different angles, making sure everything was clear. He wanted proof. Not to fight the HOA yet, but to be prepared. The next morning, he wrote a polite email to the HOA, explaining again that nothing in his yard violated the rules. He attached the photos and asked for a detailed explanation of what exactly they believed he had done wrong. He kept the message calm and respectful because he still hoped this could be resolved peacefully. He sent the email and waited. A day passed, then 2. No reply. On the 3rd day, instead of a reply, he received another letter, this one even harsher. It accused him of ignoring their warnings and said that more fines would follow if he didn't fix the issue right away. There was still no mention of what exactly was wrong. His frustration grew. He reread the letter more than once, hoping maybe he had misunderstood something. But no matter how many times he looked at it, the meaning stayed the same. They were pushing him. Harder than before? That afternoon, he walked around the neighborhood hoping to clear his head. The streets looked the same as always, quiet, clean, lined with tidy houses and trimmed lawns. But suddenly he noticed things he hadn't paid attention to before. a house with chipped paint on the window frame, another with a patch of dry grass, a third with a crooked mailbox. None of these homes had notices taped to their doors. None of them had envelopes stuffed into their mailboxes. He wasn't judging anyone else's yard. Everyone had their own life and their own problems. But it made him wonder why the HOA was focusing on him, when plenty of other places had minor issues too. He walked back home feeling more certain than before that this wasn't random. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were choosing who to enforce them on. Later that evening, he received a knock on the door. It was another neighbor, someone who had heard about his situation and came to check on him. The neighbor looked nervous, glancing around as if worried someone might overhear. "They did the same thing to me last year," the neighbor said quietly. "A few letters, then fines, then threats. I paid everything because I didn't want trouble, but I still don't know what rule I supposedly broke." The homeowner listened carefully, feeling a heavy mix of concern and frustration. He asked if the neighbor had ever pushed back or asked the board for details. "They didn't want to explain anything," the neighbor said. "Every time I asked questions, they talked around it. I felt cornered, honestly." Hearing that made everything even clearer. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, this was a pattern of pressure, a pattern of silence, a pattern of using authority to scare people. That night, he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, he felt a mix of anger and determination. He wasn't someone who liked conflict, but he also wasn't someone who would let people treat him unfairly. Not when it came to his home, something he had worked years to build and take care of. The next morning, printed out all the emails he had sent, even the ones that had gone unanswered. He added them to his growing folder of documents. He also printed the photos of his yard and placed them neatly inside as he worked. Another thought came to him. Maybe he wasn't alone. Maybe if he talked to more neighbors, he could understand the full picture of what the HOA had been doing. So throughout the day, he visited a few houses, gently asking if they had ever faced similar issues. Some said no. Others hesitated before nodding. A few even shared small stories of their own stories that sounded too familiar. Letters arriving too quickly. Rules that weren't explained clearly. Fines that seemed unfair. And almost always, a board that didn't want to listen by late afternoon. He had gathered enough information to see that the problem wasn't small. The HOA had been behaving this way for a while, quietly pressuring people into paying fines, or changing things that didn't really need changing. He felt a mix of frustration and responsibility. If he didn't speak up, the cycle would continue. But the idea of pushing back still felt intimidating. He knew HOAs had power and he didn't want to make things worse. But he also knew he couldn't ignore what was happening. Not anymore. That evening, just as he sat down for dinner, he heard the mailbox clang shut. He stood up slowly, already feeling a heavy guess about what he would find. When he opened the mailbox, he saw another envelope. Same size, same color, same bold letters on the front. He didn't open it right away. He held it for a moment, taking a breath, trying to gather his thoughts. Then he opened it carefully. The letter was even more aggressive than the previous ones. This time, it mentioned potential legal action if he continued to ignore the rules of the community. The words felt heavier than before, almost threatening. He sat on the edge of his couch, reading the letter over and over. The message was clear. They wanted him to feel pressured. They wanted him to feel scared. But instead of feeling fear, something else settled in his chest. Resolve. He wasn't going to let them push him around. Not anymore. He placed the letter into his folder, closed it firmly, and sat back with a steady breath. He didn't know exactly what the HOA's next move would be, but he knew one thing for sure. He was ready for it. The next morning came with a strange mix of calmness and tension. He woke up earlier than usual, as if his mind had already prepared itself for another long day. The sunlight crept through his curtains, lighting up the hallway the same way it always did, but something inside him felt different. There was a quiet strength building in him now, something he hadn't felt during the first few days of dealing with the HOA. After breakfast, he sat at the table with his folder of documents and opened it slowly. Each page reminded him of how the situation had grown, step by step, from a simple notice into something much bigger. He flipped through the letters, the unanswered emails, and the pictures of his yard. He stared at them not with fear now, with determination. He knew he needed to understand the rules more deeply if he wanted any chance of standing up to the board. So he opened his laptop and searched for the official HOA guidelines. He went through each section carefully, reading slowly, making notes. The more he read, the more he realized that the HOA had skipped several required steps. They were supposed to give warnings with clear explanations, time for correction, and a detailed description of the problem. None of that had happened. This wasn't just strict enforcement, it was improper action. He wrote down everything he found, making sure each point was clear. Then he searched for homeowner rights in his state. He discovered that state law required HOAs to follow certain procedures, and many of those procedures had been ignored in his case. The deeper he looked, the more confident he felt. It was as if the fog of confusion around him had finally lifted. He was no longer guessing or relying on emotion, he had facts. Later that day, he visited a neighbor he trusted, someone who had mentioned being pressured by the HOA in the past. They sat on the neighbor's front porch, the afternoon sun hanging above them, casting soft shadows. "I've been looking into everything," he said quietly. "They didn't follow the rules with me. Not even close." The neighbor nodded slowly, looking out at the street. "They do that on purpose. Most people don't question things. They just pay the fines to avoid problems." "But why?" he asked. "Why target certain people? Why skip the proper steps?" "I don't know," the neighbor admitted. "Sometimes I think they just like the control. Or maybe they assume people won't push back." He thanked the neighbor and walked home, thinking deeply. The conversation didn't give him answers, but it made his resolve stronger. If people had been quietly suffering through unfair treatment, someone had to stand up eventually. If he didn't do it now, maybe no one would. That evening, he drafted a formal request for an HOA hearing. He wrote clearly and respectfully, asking for a face-to-face meeting where he could present his evidence. He sent the email and printed a copy for his folder. He wasn't expecting them to agree easily, but he wanted everything on record, every attempt he made to resolve things peacefully. The next 2 days passed with no response. He kept checking his inbox, but nothing came. He wasn't surprised, but the silence still bothered him. Then, on the third afternoon, he heard the familiar sound of the mailbox door closing. He walked outside and found a short letter from the HOA. It confirmed a hearing date, but the tone was stiff, almost defensive, as if they were agreeing only to make it look like they were following rules. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. As the days moved closer, he prepared himself carefully. He made copies of every notice, every email, every picture. He highlighted parts of the HOA rules and state laws that supported his case. He practiced explaining everything calmly so he wouldn't let frustration get the better of him. The morning of the hearing arrived with a heavy silence. He dressed neatly, grabbed his folder, and walked toward the community center. His hands felt a little cold, but his mind was steady. He wasn't going there to fight. He was going to be heard. When he entered the building, the room was already set up. 3 board members sat at a long table, their expressions unreadable. Another employee sat off to the side, typing on a laptop, probably there to take notes. He took a deep breath and sat across from them. One of the board members started the meeting with a rehearsed speech about the importance of community rules. The words felt empty to him, as if they were being read from a script rather than spoken from any real concern. When they finished, he calmly placed his folder on the table and began. He explained how he had received the first notice without any clear explanation. He showed them pictures of his yard, taken before and after the letter. He pointed out that nothing violated the guidelines. Then he presented the second letter, the fine, and the third, the threat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse them. He simply laid out the facts. As he spoke, he noticed the board members shifting in their seats. Some avoided eye contact. Others tapped their pens nervously. They hadn't expected him to come prepared. They hadn't expected him to know the rules. He highlighted the parts of the HOA rulebook that required proper warnings and clear communication. He quoted state law where the board was required to provide detailed information before issuing fines. The room grew quiet when he finished, sat back and waited. One board member cleared their throat and tried to respond, but the words didn't sound confident. They said something vague about community expectations and maintaining standards. But they didn't point to a single real violation. They still couldn't explain what he had done wrong. He listened carefully, then asked a simple question. "Can you show me the exact rule I broke?" The board members exchanged glances. None of them answered. The silence in the room felt heavy, thicker than any argument. For the first time, the power balance had shifted. After a long pause, one of the board members said they would review the matter again and get back to him. The phrase sounded like a retreat, not a decision. They quickly ended the meeting, clearly wanting him to leave. He walked out of the community center with steady steps. He felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Control. But as he walked home, he also knew something else. The board wasn't going to let this go easily. They had been used to doing things their own way for a long time. And people in power don't usually change overnight. By the next morning, he received an email from the HOA saying they were postponing further fines until additional review. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an acknowledgement. But it was a sign that they were backing down, at least for the moment. He sat at his kitchen table, reading the email again and again. It felt like progress, but also like the calm before another storm. He had stood up for himself. And now the HOA knew they wouldn't be able to push him around icily. But he also knew that people who feel their authority threatened often react unpredictably. For the next few days, he kept documenting everything. He wrote down conversations, saved emails, and double-checked his yard daily. He felt more aware now, more alert. One afternoon, he noticed two board members walking down the street, stopping in front of several houses, taking pictures, whispering to each other. He watched from his window, wondering if they were preparing something. When they reached his house, they didn't take any pictures. They only glanced quickly at his yard and moved on. Their behavior only made him more certain. They were trying to find something, anything, to put pressure on him again. But he didn't let the sight shake him. Instead, it strengthened his resolve. If they wanted to follow the rules, he would follow them better. If they wanted to test him, he would be ready. He started reading more about homeowner rights. Looking into stories from other communities where HOA boards had abused their power, many homeowners had fought back, and many had won. Those stories gave him hope. He wasn't just doing this for himself anymore. He was doing this for the quiet neighbors who had whispered their complaints, for the people who had paid unfair fines just to avoid conflict, for anyone in the community who felt too intimidated to speak. One evening, a soft knock came at his door. When he opened it, he found another neighbor standing there. Someone he didn't know very well, but had seen around often. "I heard what happened at the hearing," the neighbor said gently. "Thank you for speaking up. A lot of us have been dealing with similar things but didn't know where to start." The words touched him more deeply than he expected. He realized then that taking a stand wasn't just about the notices. It was about restoring fairness in a place that was supposed to feel like home. As the neighbor walked away, he stood at his doorway for a moment, looking out at the quiet street. The sky was turning orange as the sun dipped lower. The neighborhood looked peaceful again, but he knew the peace was fragile. Still, for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone in what he was facing. He felt stronger, more grounded, more certain of what he needed to do next. He stepped inside, closed the door gently, and placed his folder back on the table. He wasn't done. Not yet. The HOA had tried to push him, but he was no longer the same person he had been when the first notice appeared on his door. Now, he was ready for whatever came next. He woke up early the next morning, long before the sun began to rise. His mind was full of everything that had happened the day before, and even though he was tired, he couldn't sleep anymore. He got out of bed, made a cup of tea, and sat by the small window in his kitchen. The world outside was quiet. The streetlights were still on, and the neighborhood looked peaceful, as if nothing unusual had ever happened here. But he knew better. Something inside him told him that things were just beginning. While he sipped his tea, he replayed the meeting in his head. He remembered the expressions on the faces around the table, the tone in the room, and the way they stared at him when he refused to back down. He wasn't someone who liked conflict, but he also wasn't someone who liked being pushed around. And now, more than ever, felt that the Homeowners Association wasn't simply enforcing rules, they were testing how far they could go. After finishing his drink, he put on his jacket and stepped outside. The air was cool, and he took a slow breath to calm his thoughts. He walked around his yard, checking every small detail. He didn't want to give anyone any excuse to cause more trouble. Everything looked fine, maybe too fine. Sometimes silence from the HOA felt less like peace and more like the calm before a storm. As he stood there, his neighbor walked over. She was an older woman with a calm, gentle way of speaking. She stopped by the fence and asked him if he was okay. She had heard about the meeting from someone else, and apparently the whole street had been talking about it. Everyone had their own version of the story. Some people said he had argued loudly. Others said the board members were unfair. A few people claimed he had embarrassed the HOA in front of everyone. Hearing all of this made him shake his head. "I didn't even raise my voice," he told her. She laughed softly and said that rumors travel faster than truth in this neighborhood. She then surprised him by offering her support. She said she admired the way he stood his ground. She also told him something he didn't expect. He wasn't the only one the HOA had been bothering. Others were frustrated too, but most people didn't want to get involved. They felt it was easier to stay quiet than deal with the trouble. He thanked her for the honesty, and she told him that if he needed anything, she was just next door. Her words gave him something he hadn't felt much recently: reassurance. Maybe he wasn't alone after all. Later that morning, he checked his email, and just as he feared, there was a new message from the HOA. The subject line alone made his stomach tighten. It said, "Notice regarding property compliance." He clicked it open slowly. The email contained a long, formal message listing several issues they claimed needed immediate correction. Some of these so-called issues made no sense. One item said his trash bins were visible from the street, even though he kept them behind the fence. Another claimed that his lawn was uneven. Even though he had trimmed it less than 48 hours earlier, it was obvious what they were doing. They wanted to wear him down. They wanted to overwhelm him with notices until he either gave up or made a mistake they could use against him. It was a tactic he had seen before, used in different situations by people who didn't like being challenged. He read the email twice and then pushed his chair back. He wasn't angry, at least not yet. He was more disappointed than anything. It seemed unfair that a small group of board members could decide to make someone's life difficult simply because they didn't like being questioned. After taking a few minutes to collect his thoughts, he decided to respond in the calmest way possible. He wrote a short message saying he had reviewed the claims and would look into them. But he also asked for photographic evidence of the alleged violations. He wanted everything to be clear and documented. If they were going to make accusations, he wanted proof. He hit send and sat back. Around noon, another neighbor stopped by. This one was younger and usually kept to himself, but today he looked uneasy. He asked if they could talk for a moment. They moved to the shade of a tree, and the man began speaking quietly, almost as if he was afraid someone might hear him. He explained that he had been on the HOA board 2 years ago, but had left because he didn't like the way things were being run. According to him, the same few board members had been controlling every decision for a long time. Anyone who questioned them became a target. Hearing this didn't surprise him, but the details did. The neighbor described how board members would monitor people's houses without reason, send warnings for small things, and sometimes bend rules to favor certain homeowners. "The problem isn't the rules," the neighbor said quietly. "It's the people enforcing them." They talked for almost half an hour. By the end of the conversation, he felt a mixture of concern and determination. If what he heard was true, something bigger was going on, and he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was standing up against a pattern of behavior that affected others too. In the afternoon, he decided to walk around the neighborhood. He didn't announce what he was doing. He just wanted to observe things for himself. If the HOA was claiming he had violations, he wanted to see how others were being treated. As he walked, he noticed little things: trash bins visible in several yards, lawn patches that were uneven, decorations on porches that didn't fit the guidelines. If the board really cared about enforcing rules strictly, then almost every house would have received a notice. But from what he understood, they hadn't. This was the moment he realized something clearly wasn't fair. The rules were not the issue. The selective enforcement was. He took a slow walk back home, thinking about everything he had seen. He didn't want to turn this into a fight, but he also didn't want to allow unfair treatment to continue. As he sat on his porch, the sun dipping down in the background, he felt a strong sense of clarity. This wasn't just about a lawn, a fence, or trash bins. It was about principle. He decided that the next step would be to talk to more neighbors. If other people had similar experiences, maybe they could do something together. Maybe they could show the board that they couldn't just bend rules when it suited them. He wasn't looking for drama. He simply wanted fairness. When evening came, he wrote down everything he had noticed that day in a notebook. He wanted to keep details organized, so nothing would get confused later. It gave him a sense of control, like he was preparing himself for whatever was coming next. Later that night, he received a reply from the HOA. They said they would provide photographs within a reasonable time, which sounded like another vague delay. But he wasn't discouraged. He had expected this. He knew they wouldn't give up easily. Before going to bed, he stood at his window again. The neighborhood was quiet, just like it had been that morning. But now, instead of feeling alone, he felt something else, a sense of purpose. He didn't know exactly what the next days would bring, but he knew this wasn't over. And he wasn't walking into the next chapter empty-handed. He had support, information, a determination to stand up for what was right. He turned off the lights, lay down, and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would be another day. A day that might bring more conflict or more clarity. But he was ready for it. Ready to face whatever the HOA decided to do next. Ready to protect his home and his peace. And maybe, without realizing it, ready to change more than just his own story. The next morning began slower than usual. He woke up with the weight of everything still sitting on his shoulders. But there was also a small sense of strength growing inside him. The past days had shown him something he hadn't expected. He wasn't alone. That thought changed everything. He stepped outside and stood on his porch, letting the soft morning light fall across the yard. The neighborhood was waking up one house at a time. Dogs barking, a distant car starting, a door closing somewhere down the street. It was a normal day, and yet for him, it was the beginning of something important. He walked down his steps and checked the mail, expecting another notice or letter from the HOA. To his surprise, the mailbox was empty. He sighed with relief, though he knew silence didn't mean peace. Still, it gave him a moment to breathe. After breakfast, sat down with the notebook where he had been writing everything that had happened. He added new thoughts from the night before. Then he flipped back through the pages and realized how far things had come. What started as one unfair notice had grown into a fight for fairness, for respect, and for his own peace of mind. Around mid-morning, the older woman from next door walked up to his porch. She seemed brighter today, as if she came with something encouraging to share. She told him that she had spoken with a few neighbors the night before. Apparently, word about the HOA's behavior had started to spread faster than expected. People who had stayed quiet for months, some even years, were beginning to talk. She smiled gently and said, "You might have started something without even realizing it." He didn't know what to say. He hadn't planned to start anything. He simply didn't want to be pushed around. But if his actions helped others feel braver, he couldn't be upset about that. She then handed him a small folder. Inside were copies of notices she had received over the past year. Some were strange, others unnecessary. It was clear she had been dealing with the same problem, but hadn't wanted to cause trouble. Now she felt differently. She felt like it was time to speak up. After she left, he sat quietly and looked through the papers. Each one told a small part of a bigger story. If the HOA had been doing this to her and to others, then the issue was much larger than he thought. A little while later, and the younger neighbor, the one who had previously been on the board, stopped by too. He brought a stack of documents he had saved from when he served on the HOA. While he couldn't share everything, he shared enough to show that some decisions in the past had been made without proper votes or without informing residents fully. "The problem is not the rules," the man repeated. "It's who's using them." Hearing this again only confirmed what he already knew deep down. Throughout the day, he received quiet visits from a few more neighbors. Some came with questions, others with their own stories. One person shared a complaint letter they had once tried to submit but received no response. Another talked about being warned for something minor while others were ignored for bigger issues. Every conversation gave him a clearer picture of what had been happening. By lunchtime, he realized something surprising. More people supported him than he ever expected. But with that support came responsibility. He didn't want to stir chaos or turn the neighborhood into a place full of anger and arguments. He wanted fairness, not conflict. He decided it was time to reach out to the HOA, but in a way that couldn't be ignored. That afternoon, he drafted a letter addressed to the board. He wrote slowly, carefully choosing every word. His message wasn't rude, angry, or emotional. It was clear and calm. He wrote about the repeated notices, the lack of evidence, the selective enforcement, and the concerns many residents shared. He didn't name anyone without permission, but he made it clear that he wasn't the only one with issues. He also requested a formal meeting open to all homeowners. Board members. A meeting where everyone could speak freely. A meeting where fairness, transparency, and responsibility could be discussed. He printed several copies and walked to the HOA office in the afternoon. The building wasn't large, just a small room inside a community center, but stepping inside felt heavier than it should have. He handed the letter to the receptionist and asked her to make sure every board member received a copy. She looked surprised, but she nodded and accepted the documents. Walking home afterward, he felt a strange mixture of worry and relief. He had taken a bold step. He didn't know how the board would react, but he knew he had done the right thing. The next day, he received an email from the HOA. The subject line read, "Regarding your request." He opened it slowly, bracing himself for another difficult message. To his surprise, the tone was different this time. The email stated that the board had reviewed his request and agreed to hold a community-wide meeting within a week. Everyone in the neighborhood would be invited. Questions could be raised. Concerns could be voiced. Discussions would happen in the open, not behind closed doors. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled. This was progress. Real progress. Over the next few days, neighbors continued to talk among themselves. Some said they would attend the meeting. Others admitted they were nervous, but felt encouraged, knowing they weren't alone. A few people even stopped by to thank him for being brave enough to speak up. He didn't think of himself as brave, but hearing their words gave him a quiet sense of pride. When the day of the meeting arrived, he walked to the community hall with a steady heart. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he felt ready. The room was filled with more people than he imagined far. More than usually showed up to HOA gatherings. The board members sat at a long table in the front. Their expressions were controlled, but tension hung in the air. Residents whispered quietly among themselves as he entered. Some nodded to him. Some smiled softly. He took a seat near the middle where he could see everything. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but it didn't take long for the real conversation to start. For the first time, people began speaking openly. They talked about inconsistent rule enforcement, unanswered complaints, strange notices, and confusion about how decisions were made. One by one, voices rose, not in anger, but in honesty. He didn't speak right away. He waited, listening to everyone else. Only when the room grew quiet again did he stand. He spoke simply, explaining what he had experienced, how the notices kept coming, how the claims didn't match the truth, how he had asked for evidence and never received it, how he had felt alone until his neighbors came forward. He didn't blame, accuse, or embarrass anyone. He just shared the truth. Something shifted in the room after he finished. People murmured softly. A few board members looked uncomfortable. Others looked thoughtful. The moment felt heavier than the words themselves. It felt like clarity. By the end of the meeting, something unexpected happened. The board agreed to review their processes, update their communication rules, and form a small resident committee to keep things transparent. They also agreed to withdraw the notices sent to him, acknowledging that they had not provided proper evidence. A wave of relief washed over the room. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a real step forward. The first step toward restoring trust. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to him, thanking him for speaking up. Some said they felt hopeful for the first time in a long time. Others said they felt like their voices finally mattered. He walked home slowly that evening, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting warm colors across the sky. The air smelled fresh, and for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace in his own neighborhood. When he reached his house, he stood quietly on his porch. The yard that once felt like the center of conflict now felt calm again. Not perfect, but improving. Sometimes progress wasn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was a simple shift in the right direction. He went inside, made a warm drink, and sat by the window like he had days before. But this time, the silence outside didn't feel like a warning. It felt like balance. The HOA hadn't pushed him around after all. He had stood up not only for himself, but for the whole neighborhood. And in doing so, he had helped bring change, conversation, and fairness to a place that needed it. He didn't see himself as a hero. He just saw himself as someone who chose not to stay silent. And sometimes, that was enough to make all the difference.